Jake Morrison sat in the medical chair and felt the needle go into his arm for the 100th time that week. The doctors had been changing his body for 3 months now, and each day brought new pain. His skin was no longer the pale color he was born with, but had turned the dark blue shade of the Zephyrians. His eyes now glowed with the same silver light that all members of the Empire carried. Even his bones had been made denser and stronger to match their build. Director Lisa Carter stood next to the medical table and watched the final changes happen to Jake's face. The surgery was almost done, and soon he would look exactly like one of the aliens who had ruled the galaxy for 1,000 years. She knew this mission was probably impossible, but they had to try. Earth needed to know what the Zephyrian Empire was planning, and Jake was their only hope of getting inside their defenses. The Empire controlled 847 star systems, and billions of people lived under their rule. They treated humans like animals and took whatever they wanted from Earth's colonies. Most people believed the Zephyrians were too powerful to fight, but Lisa thought they might have weaknesses that nobody had found yet. The problem was getting close enough to learn about those weaknesses. Jake had volunteered for this mission, even though he knew he might never come home. The body changes could not be undone, and he would look like an alien for the rest of his life. Worse than that was the neural implant they had put in his brain. It was supposed to help him think like a Zephyrian, but sometimes Jake felt like his own thoughts were getting mixed up with the computer signals. The doctor stepped back and nodded to Lisa. The transformation was complete, and Jake looked exactly like a young Zephyrian male. He stood up slowly and walked to the mirror on the wall. The face looking back at him belonged to a stranger. His human features were gone and replaced with the sharp angles and glowing eyes of the Empire's people. Handed him a data pad with his new identity. His name was now Vex Collar, and he was a low-level technician from a mining colony on the edge of Zephyrian space. The story was simple, because simple lies were harder to catch. He had requested a transfer to the capital world of Nexus Prime to find better work and improve his social ranking. The hardest part would be the first few days. Zephyrians communicated through smell as much as words, and their bodies released chemicals that showed their emotions and thoughts. Jake had practiced controlling these signals, but he was still learning. One mistake and the security forces would. No, he was not what he appeared to be. Jake studied the information about Zephyrian society and memorized every detail. Their culture was built on rules, and everyone knew their place in the system. Workers stayed workers, and leaders stayed leaders, unless they proved themselves worthy of promotion through official channels. Nobody questioned orders from above, and nobody tried to change the way things worked. This rigid thinking was supposed to be Jake's advantage. Humans were unpredictable and creative in ways that the Empire could not understand. Where Zephyrians followed patterns, Jake could improvise and adapt. Where they expected order, he could create chaos. At least that was what the mission planners hoped would happen. The transport ship to Nexus Prime was scheduled to leave in 6 hours. Jake would travel with other low-ranking workers who were also seeking better positions in the capital system. He would blend in with the crowd and avoid drawing attention to himself. Once he reached the planet, he would apply for work at the orbital defense platform that protected the most important world in the Empire. Lisa walked with Jake to the departure bay and stopped outside the airlock. She wanted to say something encouraging, but words seemed too small for what they were asking him to do. One human against an empire that had never been defeated in 1,000 years of conquest. The odds were impossible, but sometimes impossible things happened when brave people were willing to try. Jake picked up his single bag of belongings and turned toward the ship. His reflection in the metal door showed the alien face he would wear for the rest of his life. Somewhere inside that strange body, his human mind was still working and planning. The Zephyrians thought they knew everything about the species they had conquered, but they had never met someone like Jake Morrison. The ship's engines started up, and Jake felt the deck vibrate under his feet. In a few days, he would be walking on the most heavily defended planet in the galaxy, surrounded by enemies who would kill him instantly if they discovered his true nature. He was scared, but also excited, because finally he had a chance to strike back at the Empire that had caused so much suffering. As the transport lifted off and headed toward Zephyrian space, Jake began practicing the breathing exercises that would help him control his sense signals. Everything depended on his ability to seem like one of them while secretly gathering the information that might someday bring their empire crashing down. Jake had been working at the orbital defense platform for 2 weeks when the main power core started to fail. Alarms were screaming throughout the facility, and panicked Zephyrian technicians ran back and forth trying to figure out what was wrong. The senior engineers stood around looking at displays and arguing about which procedure to follow while the backup systems began shutting down one by one. Nobody seemed to understand that they were minutes away from losing all power to the weapons that protected Nexus Prime from attack. Jake watched them follow their standard protocols, even though it was obvious the normal procedures would not work fast enough. The Empire had trained them to never deviate from approved methods, even when those methods were clearly failing. Jake saw the problem immediately. A cascade failure in the primary fusion reactor was causing feedback loops that would destroy the entire system unless someone manually reset the control circuits. It would require crawling through maintenance tunnels that were considered too dangerous for normal operations, but Jake had dealt with similar problems during his training on Earth. He waited until the senior staff was distracted with their emergency meeting before slipping away to the reactor level. The maintenance tunnels were narrow and filled with radiation, but his modified body could handle the exposure for short periods. Jake found the manual override controls and began resetting them one by one while the facility shook around him from power fluctuations. When Jake emerged from the tunnels, the alarms had stopped and the main power was stable again. The senior engineers were amazed that the crisis had resolved itself so quickly, and they assumed their procedures had finally worked. Jake said nothing and went back to his regular duties, but Overseer Thexvarine had noticed him coming out of the restricted area. Thexvarine was older than most Zephyrians and had worked his way up through the ranks over many decades. He had sharp eyes that missed very little, and Jake realized he would need to be more careful around him. The Overseer approached Jake the next day and asked how a low-level technician knew about the maintenance systems that even senior staff avoided. Jake told him that he had studied the technical manuals during his free time because he wanted to understand how the facility worked. This was partly true, but mostly it was the kind of initiative that Zephyrians admired, even if they rarely showed it themselves. Thexvarine seemed impressed by Jake's dedication and began giving him more complex assignments. Over the following weeks, Jake proved himself to be unusually capable at solving technical problems. His human creativity allowed him to find solutions that the rule-bound Zephyrians could not see. When equipment failed, he could improvise repairs using whatever materials were available instead of waiting for proper replacement parts to arrive. When systems behaved in unexpected ways, he could adapt quickly instead of consulting procedure manuals. The other workers began to notice Jake's abilities, but they attributed his success to good genetics rather than different thinking. Zephyrian society believed that some individuals were born with superior traits, and Jake's apparent talents fit that explanation. Nobody suspected that his problem-solving skills came from a completely different approach to understanding how things worked. Jake learned that advancement in the Empire was based on demonstrated competence combined with proper social connections. Workers who showed exceptional ability could be promoted, but only if they also had sponsors among the higher ranks. Thexvarine became Jake's unofficial mentor. and began recommending him for better positions within the facility. The promotion process required Jake to undergo psychological evaluation to ensure he was mentally stable and loyal to the Empire. This was the most dangerous part of his deception, because the evaluators used both interview techniques and chemical analysis to detect unusual thought patterns. Jake had practiced controlling his responses, but he was still nervous about passing such detailed scrutiny. The evaluation took place in a sterile white room with 2 senior staff members who asked him hundreds of questions about his background and motivations. Jake stuck to his simple story about coming from a mining colony and wanting to improve his position through hard work. He made sure his body chemistry showed the right combination of ambition and submission that Cephrians expected from lower-ranked workers. When they asked about his unusual problem-solving abilities, Jake explained that he had always been good with mechanical systems and had spent years learning from older technicians at his previous job. He claimed that his success came from careful observation and following the guidance of his superiors rather than any independent thinking. This seemed to satisfy the evaluators, who were looking for compliance rather than creativity. Jake passed the evaluation and received promotion to senior technician with access to more sensitive areas of the facility. His new position gave him clearance to work on the communication systems that connected the platform to other parts of the Empire's defense network. This was exactly the kind of access he needed to begin gathering real intelligence about their military capabilities. The promotion ceremony was attended by all the senior staff, including Platform Commander Nexgorian, who supervised security for the entire facility. Jake noticed that the commander watched him carefully during the proceedings and seemed to be evaluating him for some reason. After the ceremony, Nexgorian approached Jake and congratulated him on his advancement while studying his face with intense interest. Jake felt a chill of fear as he realized that the security commander might already suspect something was wrong. Nexgorian had the authority to investigate anyone on the platform and the resources to dig deeply into background records. If he decided to look closely at Jake's supposed history from the mining colony, he might discover inconsistencies that would expose the deception. For now, Jake could only continue with his mission and hope that his careful preparation would hold up under scrutiny. He had gained access to important systems much faster than anyone had expected, but that success might have drawn unwanted attention from people who were trained to spot infiltrators. The next few weeks would determine whether his human adaptability was enough to fool an empire that had never been successfully penetrated by enemy agents. Jake's new clearance level gave him access to the Central Command facility where all communications for the orbital platform were processed. The room was filled with displays showing data streams from across the Zephyrian Empire, and Jake could see the massive scope of their control for the first time. Military reports flowed in from hundreds of star systems, while civilian administrators sent updates about production quotas and population management. What struck Jake most was how organized everything appeared to be. Every piece of information was categorized and routed through proper channels according to strict protocols. Decisions flowed down from the top levels of government and were implemented without question by lower-ranking officials. The system was incredibly efficient, but also completely dependent on central coordination from the Empire's capital world. Jake began to understand that the Zephyrians' greatest strength was also their greatest weakness. Their rigid hierarchy allowed them to control vast territories, but it also meant that disrupting the command structure could paralyze their entire operation. If someone could interfere with the central coordination systems, the Empire might collapse under its own weight. While studying the communication networks, Jake met Kara Nexus, who worked as a junior engineer in the data processing section. She was younger than most of the staff and seemed less comfortable with some of the Empire's policies than her colleagues. During break periods, she would ask questions about why certain procedures were necessary and whether there might be better ways to accomplish their goals. These kinds of questions were unusual among Zephyrians who were trained from birth to accept the established order without doubt. Jake realized that Kira represented something rare in the Empire, an individual capable of independent thought despite her conditioning. He began having conversations with her about technical matters while carefully probing her attitudes toward authority and social change. Jake discovered that Kira had grown up on a border world where she had seen the harsh treatment of conquered species firsthand. Unlike most Zephyrians who lived in the core systems, she had witnessed the brutality that maintained their empire's power. This experience had planted seeds of doubt about whether their civilization was as just and benevolent as they claimed to be. Through careful manipulation, Jake began encouraging these doubts while being very careful not to seem disloyal himself. He would ask innocent questions about whether certain policies were really necessary or suggest that perhaps some of their methods could be improved. He presented himself as someone who believed in the Empire but thought it could be made even better through small reforms. Kira responded to these conversations with obvious relief at finding someone who shared her concerns. She began telling Jake about other workers who privately questioned some of the Empire's actions, but were afraid to speak openly about their doubts. Jake realized he was discovering a hidden network of potential dissidents who could be valuable allies if handled correctly. The most important information Jake learned was about the central processing core that coordinated all Imperial operations. Kira had worked on some of the peripheral systems connected to the core, and she explained how it functioned as the brain of the entire Empire. Every major decision was processed through this massive computer system which ensured perfect coordination across their territory. Jake learned that the core was located in the most heavily defended facility on Nexus Prime and was considered completely impregnable. But his conversations with Kira revealed that the peripheral systems she worked on were directly connected to the main network. Someone with the right access and knowledge might be able to reach the core through these secondary connections. The breakthrough came when Security Commander Nexgorian announced new policies for dealing with rebellious populations on conquered worlds. The measures included mass relocations and the elimination of local leadership structures. Kira was visibly disturbed by these orders and made the mistake of questioning whether such extreme actions were really necessary. Her supervisor reported the incident to higher authorities, and Kira was scheduled for disciplinary action that would likely result in her execution for disloyalty. Jake knew he had to act quickly to save her while also protecting his own cover. He volunteered to escort Kira to the disciplinary hearing, and during the transport he helped her escape from custody. Escape required Jake to disable security systems and overcome two guards using techniques that no ordinary Zephyrian technician should know. He told Kira that he had learned fighting skills during his time on the mining colony, where workers sometimes had to defend themselves against dangerous equipment and cave-ins. She accepted this explanation because she was grateful to be alive, and did not question her rescuer's abilities too closely. Jake hid Kira in an unused storage area while he figured out how to resolve her situation. He could not simply return her to duty because she would still face charges for her earlier questioning of orders. Instead, he decided to use his growing reputation with Overseer Thex Varin to request that Kira be transferred to his technical team where her supposed rehabilitation could be supervised. The plan worked because Thex Varin trusted Jake's judgment and believed that loyal workers could help reform their colleagues who had shown signs of doubt. Kira was officially reprimanded but allowed to continue working under Jake's supervision. She understood that he had saved her life and felt a deep sense of loyalty that transcended normal Zephyrian social bonds. This incident created an unbreakable connection between Jake and Kira that he knew he could exploit for his mission. More importantly, it demonstrated something that shocked him about Zephyrian psychology. The act of showing mercy and compassion to someone in trouble was so foreign to their culture that they could not understand his motivations. They assumed he must have practical reasons for helping Kira, rather than recognizing the simple human impulse to protect someone who was vulnerable. Jake realized that this fundamental difference in thinking could be a powerful weapon. The Zephyrians had built their empire on logic and efficiency, but they had lost the ability to understand or predict behavior driven by emotion and conscience. If he could find ways to exploit this blind spot, he might be able to accomplish far more than anyone had thought possible for a single infiltrator operating alone behind enemy lines. Jake spent weeks studying the central processing core through the peripheral systems that Kira helped him access. What he discovered was both fascinating and terrifying. The core was not just a computer, it was the electronic brain that made decisions for the entire empire. Every policy, every military movement, every resource allocation flowed through this single system that had been governing Zephyrian civilization for centuries. The core operated on pure logic, using algorithms that predicted how different species and populations would respond to various types of control. It had accumulated vast amounts of data about every conquered world and used this information to maintain perfect order across hundreds of star systems. The system was so sophisticated that it could predict rebellions before they started and crushing them before they became dangerous. But Jake noticed something strange about the core's programming. All of its predictions were based on the assumption that intelligent beings would behave in rational and predictable ways. The Zephyrians had designed it according to their own psychology, which valued order and logic above all else. They could not imagine minds that operated according to different principles. Jake realized that humans represented a complete unknown to the core's algorithms. Human behavior was driven by emotions, creativity, and unpredictable impulses that did not follow logical patterns. The system had no data about how humans might react to different situations because the Empire had never bothered to study them seriously. They dismissed humans as primitive and irrelevant rather than recognizing them as a potential threat. This discovery gave Jake an idea that seemed almost too ambitious to believe. If he could introduce human-style thinking into the core's decision-making process, he might be able to cause the system to malfunction. The algorithms were designed to work with predictable inputs, but random and irrational data might cause cascade failures throughout the network. Jake began planning how to implement this strategy when he learned about Operation Purification from intercepted military communications. The Empire was preparing a massive campaign to eliminate all remaining resistance on conquered worlds. Billions of people would die as the Zephyrians completed their goal of perfect control over their territory. The operation was scheduled to begin in just a few weeks and would be coordinated entirely through the central processing core. Every military unit in the Empire would receive precise instructions about their targets and methods. The system's efficiency would ensure that the genocide was completed quickly and thoroughly with no possibility of escape for the intended victims. Jake knew he had to act immediately, but his investigation was interrupted when Security Commander Nexgorian called him for a private meeting. The commander had been watching Jake carefully ever since his rapid promotion, and apparently his suspicions had finally reached the point where direct action was required. The meeting took place in Nexgorian's office, which was designed to be intimidating with dark walls and harsh lighting that made visitors uncomfortable. The commander sat behind a massive desk and studied Jake with the cold intensity of a predator evaluating prey. He began by asking detailed questions about Jake's background and training that went far beyond what had been covered in his original evaluation. Jake stuck to his prepared story, but he could see that Nexgorian was not satisfied with the answers. The commander pointed out inconsistencies in Jake's supposed work history and noted that his technical abilities seemed far beyond what would be expected from someone with his claimed background. He also mentioned that other workers had commented on Jake's unusual problem-solving methods. The interrogation continued for hours as Nexgorian probed for weaknesses in Jake's cover story. The commander used both psychological pressure and chemical sensors to detect signs of deception, but Jake's human ability to control his emotional responses kept confusing the monitoring equipment. The Zephyrian could not understand how someone could appear calm and truthful while hiding important information. Finally, Nexgorian admitted that he could not prove Jake was lying, but warned him that he would be watching closely for any signs of suspicious behavior. Jake realized that his time was running out, and he would need to complete his mission quickly before the security commander found evidence that could expose his true identity. Jake returned to his quarters and activated the hidden quantum communicator that allowed him to contact Earth. Director Lisa Carter appeared on the small screen, looking older and more tired than when he had left months earlier. She listened as Jake explained what he had discovered about the central processing core and his plan to disrupt its operations. Lisa was shocked by the scope of what Jake was proposing. Attacking the Empire's central computer system seemed impossible for a single operative working alone with limited resources. She warned him that even if he succeeded in causing some disruption, the Zephyrians would quickly repair any damage and hunt down whoever was responsible. Jake explained that he was not planning to destroy the core, but rather to reprogram it with human behavioral patterns that would cause it to make decisions the Empire could not understand or control. The beauty of this approach was that the Zephyrians would not realize what was happening until it was too late to stop the cascade failures. But Lisa had devastating news about the military situation. Earth's forces were still years away from being able to mount any effective resistance against the Empire. Even if Jake's mission succeeded, there would be no backup plan and no way to extract him from enemy territory. He would be completely on his own, with no hope of rescue or support. Jake accepted this information without surprise because he had always known this was likely to be a one-way mission. What mattered now was stopping Operation Purification and giving the conquered species a chance to break free from Zephyrian control. If his sacrifice could accomplish that goal, then it would be worth whatever personal cost he had to pay. The conversation ended with Lisa wishing him luck and reminding him that billions of lives depended on his success. Jake shut down the communicator and began making final preparations for the most ambitious intelligence operation in human history. Tomorrow, he would attempt to turn the Empire's greatest weapon against itself, using nothing more than human unpredictability, and one alien's growing doubts about the system she had served her entire life. The Millennium Celebration was the most important event in Zephyrian history, and Jake knew it represented his best chance to access the central processing core. Every facility in the Empire would be connected to the main network for a synchronized display of power that would demonstrate their absolute control over conquered territories. The core would be handling more data traffic than usual, which might help disguise Jake's intrusion into the system. Jake had spent days preparing the virus that would introduce human behavioral patterns into the core's decision-making algorithms. The program was not designed to destroy anything, but rather to make the system think like a human instead of a Zephyrian. It would cause the core to make choices based on emotion, creativity, and moral considerations rather than pure logic and efficiency. The challenge was getting the virus into the system without being detected by the security protocols that protected the core from unauthorized access. Jake needed Kira's help to reach the peripheral networks, but he could not tell her the real purpose of what they were doing. Instead, he convinced her that they were implementing a minor software update that would improve system performance during the celebration. Kira trusted Jake completely. After he had saved her from execution and she agreed to help him access the restricted data channels. She believed they were doing routine maintenance work, and had no idea that they were actually preparing to attack the foundation of the Empire's power. Jake felt guilty about deceiving someone who had become a genuine friend, but he could not risk exposing her to the consequences of his actions. The celebration began at exactly the same moment across all Zephyrian territories, as the Corps coordinated a massive display of military strength. Warships performed synchronized maneuvers, while ground forces demonstrated their readiness to crush any resistance. The message to conquered peoples was clear. The Empire was eternal, and opposition was futile. Jake waited until the network traffic reached its peak before inserting his virus into the data stream. The program was small and carefully disguised to look like routine system updates, so it passed through the security filters without triggering any alarms. Within minutes, it had spread throughout the peripheral networks and was beginning to infiltrate the Corps' main processing centers. At first, nothing seemed to happen as the virus quietly embedded itself into the Corps' operating systems. Jake watched the status displays and saw normal patterns continuing across the Empire as military units followed their programmed routines. But slowly, the virus began to alter the decision-making algorithms that controlled every aspect of Zephyrian civilization. The first signs of trouble appeared in the logistics networks that managed supply deliveries to military bases. Instead of optimizing for efficiency, the system began making choices based on fairness and equity. Supplies were diverted from well-equipped core worlds to neglected frontier outposts where conquered peoples were struggling with shortages. Changes seemed minor, but they violated fundamental principles of Zephyrian resource allocation. More serious problems emerged in the military command structure as the Corps began issuing orders that reflected human concepts of mercy and proportional response. Units preparing for Operation Purification received instructions to minimize civilian casualties and avoid targeting non-combatants. Some commanders were told to negotiate with rebel groups rather than simply destroying them. Commander Rex Prime on the capital world was the first to realize that something was seriously wrong with the Corps' behavior. The Supreme Leader had dedicated his entire life to maintaining Zephyrian order, and he could see that the system was making decisions that contradicted their basic values. He demanded immediate reports from technical staff about what might be causing these anomalies. The technical experts were baffled because all their diagnostic programs showed that the Corps was functioning normally. The virus had been designed to operate within acceptable parameters, so it did not trigger any error messages or system alerts. From the perspective of monitoring software, everything appeared to be working correctly, even though the actual decisions being made were completely contrary to Zephyrian logic. Jake watched the chaos spread through the Empire's communication networks as confused. Administrators reported receiving contradictory orders from Central Command. Military officers were asking for clarification about instructions that seemed to violate their training and doctrine. Civilian governors were being told to implement policies that prioritized local needs over imperial requirements. The situation deteriorated rapidly as the virus spread deeper into the Corps' decision-making processes. The system began making choices based on human concepts like individual rights, cultural preservation, and democratic consultation. These ideas were completely foreign to Zephyrian psychology, and the results seemed random and irrational to imperial administrators. Across the empire conquered, peoples began to notice that their oppressors were behaving strangely. Harsh punishments were being reduced or eliminated entirely, while local customs that had been banned were suddenly being protected by imperial decree. Military units that had been preparing for genocide operations were instead being ordered to provide humanitarian assistance to the populations they had intended to destroy. Security Commander Nexgorian finally confronted Jake as the orbital Platform systems began showing the same erratic behavior as the rest of the Empire. The commander had realized that Jake was somehow connected to the crisis, even though he could not prove how one low-ranking technician could have caused such widespread disruption. The confrontation took place in the central command facility as alarms sounded throughout the station. Nexgorian accused Jake of sabotage and demanded to know how he had penetrated the core's security systems. Jake maintained his innocence while preparing for the physical conflict that seemed inevitable. The security commander was larger and stronger than Jake, but his Zephyrian training had not prepared him for fighting someone who used unpredictable tactics. Jake's human creativity gave him advantages that his opponent could not anticipate or counter. The battle became a symbol of the larger conflict between order and chaos that was tearing the Empire apart. As they fought, Jake could see through the command center's windows that other parts of the station were also experiencing system failures. The rigid hierarchy that had maintained Zephyrian power for 1,000 years was collapsing as the core's human-influenced decisions spread throughout their civilization. Operation Purification had been canceled and replaced with orders for peaceful negotiation with rebel groups. The Empire's greatest strength had become its greatest weakness, as the very efficiency that allowed them to control vast territories now worked against them. The virus was not destroying their technology, but rather making it think in ways that Zephyrian minds could not comprehend or control. The central processing core systems were failing across the entire Empire as Jake's virus continued spreading through every connected network. What the Zephyrians could not understand was that the technology was not being destroyed, but rather transformed to think like a human mind. The core was now making decisions based on compassion, creativity, and individual freedom instead of the rigid logic that had maintained Imperial control for 1,000 years. Jake's fight with Security Commander Nexgorian ended when the station's artificial gravity failed, and they were both thrown against the ceiling. Emergency lighting flickered on as backup systems struggled to maintain basic life support throughout the facility. Through the chaos, Jake could hear confused voices as Zephyrian workers tried to understand why their sophisticated technology was behaving in completely unpredictable ways. Commander Rex Prime made a desperate decision to shut down the central processing core entirely, rather than allow it to continue issuing orders that violated everything the Empire stood for. But when his technicians attempted to disconnect the system, they discovered that doing so would leave their vast territory completely undefended. The core had become so integral to their operations that removing it would cause immediate collapse of their government and military. The supreme leader faced an impossible choice between allowing the chaos to continue or destroying the foundation of Zephyrian civilization. Either option would end the Empire's ability to maintain control over conquered worlds, but shutting down the core would guarantee immediate defeat, while leaving it operational might allow some chance of regaining control once they understood what was happening. Across the galaxy, rebellions began breaking out on worlds that had been peaceful for centuries. The virus had caused Imperial forces to receive orders, emphasizing negotiation and restraint instead of their usual brutal suppression of resistance. Local populations realized that their oppressors were paralyzed by confusion and began demanding freedom from Zephyrian rule. On some worlds, Imperial governors tried to ignore the contradictory orders from Central Command and maintain control through traditional methods. But their own computer systems had been infected with the same virus and were refusing to implement harsh policies against civilian populations. Weapons systems developed safety protocols that prevented them from firing on non-combatants, while transportation networks began prioritizing refugee movements over military logistics. Jake helped Kira escape from the collapsing orbital platform as explosions shook the facility and emergency evacuation alarms echoed through the corridors. She still did not understand what had really happened, but she could see that the rigid order of Zephyrian society was breaking down around them. For the first time in her life, she felt hope that change might be possible. They reached an escape pod just as Security Commander Nexgorian recovered from the gravity failure and resumed his pursuit. The commander was injured, but still determined to capture Jake and learn how he had managed to cripple their empire. Jake sealed the pod's hatch and launched toward the planet's surface while laser fire from station security forces streaked past them. The pod's navigation system was infected with the same virus that had spread throughout Imperial networks, and instead of following its programmed landing coordinates, it touched down in a remote area where Zephyrian resistance groups had been hiding. Jake found himself surrounded by aliens who had spent their lives fighting against the Empire and were amazed to meet the human responsible for its sudden collapse. Kira finally learned Jake's true identity when he revealed himself to the Resistance fighters. She was shocked to discover that her friend and rescuer was actually a member of the species that most Zephyrians considered barely intelligent. But she had seen enough of Jake's abilities and character to know that Imperial propaganda about human inferiority was completely wrong. The resistance groups across the galaxy began coordinating their activities as Imperial forces proved unable to respond effectively to multiple simultaneous uprisings. The virus had made it impossible for the Zephyrians to organize the kind of massive military response that had crushed previous rebellions. Instead of receiving orders for systematic extermination, rebel forces found themselves facing confused enemies who seemed uncertain about their own objectives. Commander Rex Prime made one final attempt to regain control by ordering all Imperial forces to ignore directives from the central processing core and follow only direct commands from local commanders. But the virus had infected communication networks so thoroughly that even these backup orders were filtered through systems that modified them according to human moral principles. Military units found themselves receiving instructions to protect civilian populations and respect local customs instead of destroying everything that challenged Imperial authority. Some Zephyrian officers tried to follow their original training, but their own equipment refused to cooperate with actions that the virus-infected systems classified as unnecessarily cruel or destructive. Jake established contact with Earth using a resistance communication network and reported the success of his mission to Director Lisa Carter. The 1,000-year empire was fragmenting into hundreds of independent systems as the rigid control structure that had held it together dissolved completely. For the first time since the conquest began, there was real hope that the oppressed peoples of the galaxy might regain their freedom. The final confrontation came when Security Commander Nexgorian tracked Jake to the resistance base and demanded single combat to settle their conflict. Jake accepted the challenge even though his opponent was physically superior, because he knew that this fight represented more than personal rivalry. It was a symbolic battle between the old order of rigid hierarchy and the new possibility of freedom and choice. Jake's human unpredictability gave him the advantage he needed to defeat Nexgorian, despite the commander's superior strength and training. But when the fight ended, Jake made a decision that completely baffled his opponent. Instead of killing the defeated enemy, Jake offered mercy and asked if Nexgorian wanted to help build something better than the empire they had both served. The concept of showing compassion to a defeated foe was so foreign to Zephyrian psychology that Nexgorian could not understand Jake's motivations. This act of mercy broke something fundamental in the commander's worldview, and he began to question everything he had believed about the necessity of Imperial control and the high superiority of Zephyrian values. Years later, the former empire had become a loose confederation of free worlds where different species worked together as equals rather than rulers and subjects. Jake remained as an advisor and mediator, helping to resolve conflicts between groups that had been enemies for generations. His success had proven that humanity's greatest strength was not superior technology or military power, but rather the ability to think creatively and treat others with dignity, regardless of their differences. The galaxy was far from perfect, and there were still conflicts and problems that needed to be solved. But for the first time in 1,000 years, the future seemed full of possibilities rather than predetermined by the rigid structures of imperial control. One human spy had indeed undone an empire by introducing the revolutionary concept that intelligence could be combined with compassion to create something better than what had existed before.